Here's a 20,000-character YouTube script for your video titled Colonial Boarding Schools Around the World, Stripping Indigenous Identity Under Racist Policies channel. Equal Voices Hub. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be taken from your family, your language, your very name because someone decided your identity didn't belong? What if being who you were meant punishment, and forgetting who you were meant survival? This is the story of Colonial Boarding School, story that spans continents and centuries, from Canada to Australia, the United States to New Zealand. Governments and churches built institutions not to educate Indigenous children but to erase them, to kill the Indian in the child, as one chilling phrase put it. But they survived, they remembered, and today, their voices demand that we remember too. Before we begin, comment below with which untold chapter of Indigenous resilience you'd like us to explore next. Let's begin. It was called assimilation, but in truth it was cultural genocide. The boarding schools that sprang up across the colonial world in the 19th and 20th centuries weren't simply schools. They were factories of forgetting designed to transform Indigenous children into colonial subjects. Children were kidnapped or coerced from their families. They had their hair cut, traditional clothing stripped, names changed, and native languages banned. They were punished for speaking the words of their ancestors, beaten for singing the songs of their people, forbidden from practicing ceremonies that connected them to land, spirit, and identity. And this wasn't unique to one country. Canada. The residential school system from the 1870s to the 1990s. More than 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were placed in Canada's residential school system, run by churches and funded by the government. These schools became notorious for physical abuse, sexual violence, disease, and death. Children as young as 4 were taken from their homes. Many never returned. The system's official purpose was to integrate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian society, but in practice it aimed to destroy their cultures. The schools operated on a chilling premise that Indigenous ways of life were inferior, that children needed to be saved from their own families. Survivors described beatings for speaking Cree or Dene, being locked in dark closets for crying, being told their parents were heathens and savages. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in 2008, called what happened a cultural genocide. It documented thousands of deaths in the schools, many from neglect, malnutrition, and disease. Some children died trying to escape, freezing in the Canadian wilderness. In 2021, unmarked graves began to be uncovered at former school sites. The number over 1,300 so far is staggering, and more searches are underway. The United States, Indian boarding schools in the US, over 350 government-funded church-run Indian boarding schools operated between 1819 and the late 20th century. The first and one of the most infamous was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, founded in 1879 in Pennsylvania by Army officer Richard Henry Pratt. His philosophy: kill the Indian, save the man. Thousands of Native American children were forcibly enrolled. They were given English names, Christian instruction, military-style discipline. Family visits were rare or forbidden. Survivors recall brutal punishments: soap in the mouth for speaking Navajo, whippings for praying in Lakota, girls having their braids hacked off each strand, a sacred symbol of their heritage. Many children died of tuberculosis, measles, influenza, or heartbreak. Like Canada, the US has begun investigating grave sites, and the Department of the Interior's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative is documenting the horrific legacy. One recent discovery: 53 burial sites at US schools, many unmarked. This was not education, this was indoctrination. A war on identity. Australia, the stolen generations in Australia. The impact of colonial boarding schools intersected with a broader policy of child removal. From 1910 to 1970, government agencies and churches forcibly took up to 100,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. These children are known today as the stolen generations. Many were placed in institutions or fostered out to white families, where they were taught to reject their Aboriginal heritage. They were trained for servitude as maids, farmhands, or laborers. Like in Canada and the US, the goal was to absorb them into white society, often through boarding schools and missions that strictly forbade any expression of Indigenous culture. Some children were told their parents were dead. Others were abused physically and sexually. They grew up disconnected from their roots, struggling with identity, trauma, and loss. It wasn't until 2008 that Australia issued a national apology, with Prime Minister Kevin Rudd formally saying sorry for the pain caused. But healing is ongoing, because the trauma didn't end with the last school closure, it lives in generations. New Zealand Māori and the native schools system. In New Zealand, Māori children were subjected to a system of native schools beginning in the 1860s. Unlike in Canada or the US, these schools were often located in Māori communities, but they served a similar purpose. They sought to replace Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, with English. Children were punished for speaking their native tongue. Traditional knowledge systems were dismissed or ignored. The goal was to produce useful citizens of the British Empire. The reality was intergenerational cultural loss. By the 1980s, Tereo Mabori was endangered, spoken fluently by only a small fraction of the population. A grassroots revival movement fought back, leading to the establishment of Kahanga Rio, language nests, immersion schools, and cultural resurgence. But the shadow of those early assimilationist schools still lingers. Africa and Asia, missionary and colonial schools, though less studied, similar systems emerged in colonized parts of Africa and Asia, in Kenya, Nigeria, India, and the Philippines. Missionary schools imposed European languages, Christianity, and Western dress. Local languages were often banned or discouraged. Traditional religions were demonized. In Rwanda, colonial education reinforced ethnic divisions, laying groundwork for future conflict. In India, British schooling promoted the idea that European knowledge was superior to indigenous systems like Ayurveda or Sanskrit literature. The aim wasn't just literacy. It was hierarchy, indoctrination, subservience. Indigenous children in these systems were taught to see their heritage as backward. Colonial schooling didn't just steal culture, it instilled shame in what remained. Why did this happen? At the core of these systems was a lie that European civilization was inherently better. Colonial powers believed they were bringing light to darkness, but they were extinguishing identities. These schools weren't about education, they were about erasure. The children weren't empty vessels, they were targeted because they held the future of their people. Break the children and you break the continuity of culture. And yet, despite everything, despite forced silence, isolation, and trauma, indigenous communities have held on. Resilience and resistance. Many survivors never stopped fighting for their cultures. In Canada, residential school survivors led the push for truth commissions and reparations. In the US, Native American activists have reclaimed boarding school sites, turning them into centers for healing and language revitalization. In Australia, the stolen generations fight for access to records, reunification with families, and legal redress. In New Zealand, Mbori language revitalization has become a powerful cultural movement, restoring pride and reversing decline. Across the world, Indigenous youth today are learning the languages their grandparents were punished for speaking. They are reclaiming ceremonies once outlawed. They are writing books, creating art, leading protests. They are refusing to forget and demanding that the world remember. The ongoing fight for justice, reckoning with the past, means more than apologies. It means returning land, reforming education, preserving languages, funding mental health services, holding governments and churches accountable. And it means listening to survivors, to elders, to youth. Because the impact of these schools didn't end with their closures. The trauma is intergenerational. The healing must be too. We must also ask, where do similar systems still exist? Where are Indigenous children still being separated from culture, family, and land under different names? Foster care, detention, underfunded schools. The story of colonial boarding schools is not over. It continues in silence. Unless we choose to break that silence, let's not remember these schools as relics of the past, but as warnings for the present. To every survivor who still carries the pain, the memory, the language, they are not forgotten. To every child who lost their name, their voice, their family, you are not invisible. To every community rebuilding what was nearly destroyed, your resilience is the future. This is not just a history of what was done to Indigenous peoples. This is a history of how they rose, resisted, and reclaimed what was theirs. If this story moved you, share it. Let's make sure the silence ends here. Comment below. What's one thing you didn't know about Indigenous boarding schools? And whose story should we tell next? Until next time, this is Equal Voices Hub, standing with the silenced, amplifying the unheard.